Close your eyes and imagine yourself walking along a cobblestone street in a medieval European town, where the afternoon light casts long shadows between half-timbered buildings, and the air carries the mingled scents of bread from nearby bakeries, smoke from chimneys, and something else, something harder to name. At the corners where the shadows gather deepest, where the stone steps of churches meet the worn paths of countless feet, figures wait in silence. They are wrapped in threadbare cloaks, their faces often hidden beneath hoods that have seen too many seasons, their hands extended in gestures that speak of need older than the stones beneath their feet. These are the beggars of medieval Europe, and their stories are written not in chronicles or royal records, but in the quiet spaces between history's grand narratives. Tonight, as you settle into comfort and warmth, let us walk together through their world. A world where survival depended on the kindness of strangers, where each dawn brought uncertainty, and where dignity was something that had to be carefully guarded like the last ember in a dying fire. If you find peace in these forgotten stories, consider subscribing for more journeys through history's quieter corners, where the voices of the overlooked still echo if we listen closely enough. In the medieval world, poverty was not simply the absence of wealth. It was a chasm that separated entire ways of existence. Picture society as a great stone pyramid, where kings and nobles occupied the sunlit peak, merchants and craftsmen found their place on the sturdy middle tiers, and peasants formed the broad foundation, their labor supporting all who stood above. Yet below even this foundation, in the shadows cast by the pyramid itself, existed those who had fallen beyond the reach of any safety net, the beggars who lived not within society's structure, but in its margins. The medieval mind understood poverty through the lens of divine order, where each person's station was believed to be appointed by God's will. Peasants, though poor, had their place in the feudal system. They belonged to the land, and the land belonged to them in ways that bound them to lords and communities. They had duties and, with those duties, certain protections. A serf might never know wealth, but he knew where he would sleep each night and could expect bread, however coarse, at his table. But beggars existed outside this order entirely. They belonged nowhere and to no one, their very presence a reminder that the carefully constructed hierarchy of medieval life had cracks through which human beings could simply disappear. Where a peasant's poverty was understood as part of God's plan, a beggar's destitution raised uncomfortable questions about divine justice and social responsibility. The wealthy saw poverty as both a test of Christian charity and a potential threat to social stability. Monks and priests spoke of the blessed poor, reminding congregations that Christ himself had lived without possessions, that charity toward the needy was a path to salvation. Yet this same society created laws to control and limit the movement of the destitute, reflecting a deep ambivalence about those who lived by asking rather than working. In the minds of medieval people, there existed a careful distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor. The deserving poor included widows with young children, the elderly who could no longer work, the sick and disabled who could not support themselves through labor. These were seen as victims of circumstance, worthy of Christian compassion. The undeserving poor, by contrast, were those deemed capable of work but unwilling to accept it. Vagabonds, wanderers, those who chose the road over settling into the established order of rural or urban life. This distinction shaped every interaction between beggar and benefactor, creating a careful dance of presentation and judgment that played out countless times each day on medieval streets. A beggar's survival often depended on appearing sufficiently deserving, displaying visible signs of genuine need, while avoiding any suggestion of choice or deception in their circumstances. The gap between those who begged and those who gave was not merely economic but existential. The merchant who dropped a coin into an outstretched palm lived in a world of contracts and credit, of guild protections and family inheritance. The noble who distributed alms from his castle gate inhabited a realm of landed wealth that stretched back generations. Even the craftsman who occasionally shared bread with a hungry stranger possessed skills, tools, and a place in the urban economy that provided both identity and security. For the beggar, however, each day began with the fundamental uncertainty of whether it would end with food and shelter, or with hunger and cold. This uncertainty shaped not just their daily routines, but their very sense of self in a world where identity was so closely tied to one's place in the social hierarchy. The path into beggary was rarely sudden. It was more often a gradual descent, like water slowly wearing away stone, until the familiar landmarks of ordinary life had eroded beyond recognition. In the agricultural communities that dotted medieval Europe, most people lived only a failed harvest away from hunger, only an illness or injury away from destitution. The systems that supported medieval life, while providing stability in good times, offered little resilience when catastrophe struck. Imagine a peasant family in a small village, their life following the ancient rhythms of planting and harvest, feast days and fasting seasons. The father works the Lord's land, as well as the small plot that feeds his family, while the mother tends children, chickens, and a garden that provides much of their sustenance. Their children grow learning the skills they will need to continue this life. The boys following their father to the fields, the girls learning to spin, weave, and manage a household. This is not prosperity by any measure, but it is stability embedded in generations of tradition and community. Then comes the year when the rains fail, or arrive too late, or fall so heavily that the grain rots in the fields before it can be harvested. The Lord's demands do not diminish with the crop yield. Taxes and rents must still be paid, leaving the family with barely enough grain to see them through to spring. They begin eating less, then eating the seed grain saved for next year's planting, then trading away their few possessions for bread that grows more expensive as scarcity spreads through the region. When winter deepens and their stores run empty, they face impossible choices. Perhaps the father ventures to nearby towns seeking work, but finds that others from failing harvests have had the same idea. Too many hands competing for too few opportunities. Maybe illness strikes when bodies weakened by hunger can least resist it, taking away the primary provider just when the family needs every possible source of income. With their tiny plot unable to sustain them, and no reserve to fall back upon, they might abandon the village entirely, carrying what little they can manage and hoping to find better prospects elsewhere. But medieval law tied peasants to the land. Leaving without permission was itself a crime, and arriving in a new place without established connections meant being viewed as vagrants, regardless of the circumstances that drove them to wander. Or perhaps the decline began differently, with war sweeping across the countryside, soldiers from one army or another demanding provisions, burning crops, driving off livestock. In such times, the careful balance that made peasant life possible could be destroyed in a single season, leaving families to choose between starvation in familiar surroundings or uncertainty on the roads. Disease, too, carved its own path to destitution. When plague or fever swept through a community, it often took the strongest first, the parents and providers who had the most contact with the outside world. Children orphaned by disease faced a stark reality. Rural communities, struggling to survive themselves, had little capacity to absorb additional mouths to feed. Many such children simply drifted away from the villages where they had been born, joining the growing population of wanderers seeking sustenance wherever it might be found. The urban poor faced their own particular vulnerabilities. A craftsman's apprentice whose master died unexpectedly might find himself without the connections needed to establish his own workshop. A servant dismissed from a wealthy household for theft, whether guilty or falsely accused, would struggle to find new employment without a reference from previous employers. In cities where employment depended heavily on guild membership and family networks, those who fell outside these protective structures often found themselves with few alternatives to begging. Women faced especially precarious circumstances: a widow whose husband had left debts rather than inheritance, a young woman whose family could not afford a dowry, a servant who had been dismissed due to pregnancy. All might find themselves with no acceptable means of support in a society that offered women few opportunities for independent survival. For many, the choice came down to begging, prostitution, or starvation, and sometimes the lines between these alternatives blurred in the daily struggle to survive. The transformation from housed and fed to homeless and hungry often came with a psychological dimension that was almost as devastating as the physical privation. In medieval society, identity was closely tied to place and role. You were not simply yourself, but yourself in relation to family, community, occupation, and lord. To become a beggar was to lose not just material security, but social identity itself, to become a person defined primarily by lack and need rather than by connection and contribution. The clothing of medieval beggars told stories that words could not capture, each patch and tear a chapter in narratives of decline and endurance. In a society where garments were precious, where cloth was expensive and clothing was often passed down through generations like family heirlooms, what a person wore spoke immediately of their station and circumstances. For beggars, clothing became both protection against the elements and a crucial element in the complex performance of seeking charity. Picture the cloak of someone who has been on the roads for months, originally perhaps a decent woolen garment, the kind that might have belonged to a prosperous peasant or urban craftsman. Now it hangs heavy with patches of different colors and textures, each one telling of a moment when desperation drove someone to trade their remaining possessions for needle and thread, or when a charitable soul offered not coins but the means to mend what was already worn beyond dignity. The original weave, once tight and warming, has loosened and stretched with constant wear and weather. Rain has soaked through it so many times that the wool holds moisture like a sponge, never quite drying completely in the brief interludes between storms. The edges, once finished with care, have frayed into strings that catch on rough stone walls and wooden door frames, pulling away tiny threads that mark each place where charity has been sought. Beneath such cloaks, the clothing tells even starker stories. Tunics that once fit properly now hang loose on frames diminished by hunger, or strain tight across bodies swollen with the peculiar bloating that comes from eating too much bread and too little of anything else. The fabric, originally dyed in the warm browns and blues that were the mark of modest prosperity, has faded to uncertain colors that seem to shift in different lights, not quite brown, not quite grey, but something in between that speaks of many washings in cold streams and many days under harsh sun. Shoes present perhaps the most heartbreaking element of a beggar's attire. Good leather boots were expensive beyond the reach of most people, but even simple shoes represented a significant investment for a medieval family. The shoes of a long-term beggar often began as sturdy work boots or modest leather shoes, but the constant walking on cobblestones and rough roads wore them down in ways they were never designed to endure. The soles, meant for occasional walks between home and field or workshop, develop holes that let in every puddle and pebble. The leather uppers crack and separate, held together with strips of cloth or twine that must be retied constantly as they stretch and break. In winter, such shoes provide little protection against cold stone and frozen mud, leading to chilblains, frostbite, and the shuffling gait of someone whose feet are always cold and often in pain. Many beggars eventually resort to wrapping their feet in strips of cloth or rags, creating makeshift shoes that offer minimal protection, but can be replaced more easily than leather when they wear through. These fabric shoes, if they can be called shoes at all, become soaked through in minutes when the roads are wet and offer no support for feet that must carry their owners mile after mile in search of charity. The contrast between the clothing of beggars and that of those from whom they sought help was stark and deliberately maintained. Merchants wore garments of fine wool, or even silk, dyed in rich colors that spoke of prosperity, deep blues created with expensive indigo, bright reds that required costly cochineal or madder root. Their clothes fit well, showed no patches, and were replaced regularly as fashion changed or fabric wore out. Nobles dressed in ways that proclaimed their status from a distance, furs in winter, fine linen in summer, garments cut in the latest styles that changed frequently enough to ensure that only the wealthy could keep up with them. Their shoes were made of the finest leathers, sometimes decorated with precious metals or gems, and were replaced long before they showed signs of wear. Even ordinary craftsmen and peasants, while not wealthy, typically maintained clothing that was clean, reasonably well fitting, and appropriate to their station. Their garments might be simple and patched, but the patches were neat, applied when the original fabric first began to show wear rather than after it had deteriorated completely. Their shoes, while not luxurious, were functional and maintained with the kind of regular care that comes from having a settled place to store and repair possessions. This visual distinction was not accidental. It served important social functions in medieval society. The appearance of a beggar needed to communicate genuine need without suggesting deception or choice in their circumstances. Clothing that was too neat might suggest that the person was not truly destitute, while garments that were too far deteriorated might suggest moral failings or a lack of proper Christian humility. A dawn broke grey and cold over medieval streets, the first light revealing figures stirring in doorways and under the eaves of buildings where they had sought what shelter they could find. For those whose lives were shaped by begging, each day began with the same fundamental uncertainties and the same careful calculations about where to seek charity, how to present themselves, and whether this day would bring enough to ensure another night of survival. The beggar waking in a doorway or alley faced immediate challenges that those with homes never considered. Sleep, when it came at all, was light and broken, one ear always listening for the approach of night watchmen who might move them along, or for the sounds of other desperate people who might pose a threat to the few possessions they carried. The cold seeped through whatever covering they had managed to find, making true rest nearly impossible, so that they rose each morning already weary. First came the need to assess what the day might hold. Was it a market day, when the streets would fill with people who might have coins to spare? Was it a religious festival, when charity was especially encouraged and the wealthy might distribute alms outside churches? Or was it an ordinary day, when the competition for attention and coins would be fierce among the community of beggars who knew the same promising locations? The morning routine, if it could be called that, involved visiting the places where water could be found, a well, a fountain, or a stream, to wash as much as circumstances allowed. Cleanliness was more than comfort for a beggar, it was strategy. Those seeking charity needed to strike a careful balance in their appearance, looking sufficiently desperate to merit compassion, but not so filthy or diseased as to inspire fear or disgust rather than generosity. After this minimal preparation, the day's real work began, the careful choreography of positioning, timing, and presentation that might mean the difference between eating and going hungry. The most promising locations were well known to the community of beggars, but they were also limited in number and could not accommodate everyone who might wish to occupy them. Church doors represented perhaps the most reliable opportunities, particularly during morning mass, when the faithful emerged with their thoughts turned toward Christian charity. But arriving too early meant a long wait in cold and discomfort, while arriving too late meant finding the best positions already occupied by others who had risen earlier or had more experience in judging the timing of services. The approach to potential benefactors required its own careful art. Too aggressive a request might frighten away someone who might otherwise have offered something, while too passive a presence might be overlooked entirely in the bustle of daily life. The experienced beggar learned to read the signs of wealth and generosity, which merchants might be disposed to charity, which nobles made a practice of regular almsgiving, which craftsmen might spare a piece of bread, even if they had no coins to offer. The rhythm of such days was punctuated by long periods of waiting, standing or sitting in positions that offered the best chances of encountering charitable souls while providing whatever protection from weather might be available. These hours of waiting were filled with observation, watching the patterns of daily life unfold, noting who passed by regularly and who might be approached, learning the schedules of religious services and market activities that shaped the flow of potential opportunities. Midday often brought the best chances for receiving food, as kitchens prepared meals, and those with enough to eat might remember those without. The doors of monasteries and wealthy households sometimes opened to distribute leftover bread or soup to whoever might be waiting, though such distributions were unpredictable and never guaranteed. Afternoon and evening presented different opportunities and challenges. As the day's business wound down, some merchants might be more generous with unsold bread or produce rather than let it spoil overnight. But the approaching darkness also brought increased urgency to find not just food but shelter, and the places where a beggar might safely spend the night were even more limited than the places where charity might be found. The constant movement, the endless walking from one potential source of charity to another, took its toll on bodies already weakened by irregular meals and inadequate shelter. Feet, poorly protected by worn shoes or makeshift coverings, developed blisters and sores that made each step painful. Joints, stressed by sleeping on cold stone and standing for hours in uncomfortable positions, ached with a persistent pain that never quite disappeared, Yet within this difficult routine, there were moments of unexpected humanity and connection. A conversation with a sympathetic stranger, a shared joke with another beggar, a moment of genuine kindness from someone who took time to see the person behind the extended hand. These brief encounters provided emotional sustenance that was almost as important as the material aid that enabled physical survival. In the shadow of every medieval church stood figures whose presence spoke of both human need and divine commandment, their quiet waiting a daily reminder of Christ's teaching that charity toward the least of society was charity toward God himself. The relationship between church and beggar was complex, woven from threads of theology, practical necessity, and the sometimes uncomfortable reality of living according to Christian principles in a world where resources were always limited. The medieval church taught that poverty could be a blessing, that the poor were closer to God's kingdom than the wealthy, who might be corrupted by their possessions. This doctrine of the blessed poor created a theoretical framework in which beggars served an important spiritual function. They provided opportunities for the wealthy to practice charity, to demonstrate Christian virtue, and to earn salvation through good works. In this understanding, the beggar was not simply a recipient of charity, but a participant in a sacred transaction that benefited both giver and receiver. Church doors became natural gathering places for those seeking alms, not only because congregations emerged from services with their thoughts turned toward Christian duty, but because the church actively encouraged this arrangement. Many ecclesiastical buildings were designed with porches and steps that could accommodate groups of poor petitioners, and church officials often regulated how and when such gatherings could take place, ensuring that the process of seeking charity did not disrupt religious observances. The timing of religious services created rhythms that shaped the beggar's day. Morning Mass brought early opportunities as the devout began their day with worship and thoughts of charity. Midday prayers might offer smaller but more frequent chances as individual worshippers came and went. Evening services, particularly during important religious seasons, could be especially profitable as larger congregations gathered and the church's emphasis on charity was most strongly pronounced. Monasteries presented their own particular relationship with the poor. Monastic communities were often required by their rules to provide hospitality to travelers and charity to the needy, making them more reliable sources of aid than individual households or secular institutions. The monasteries' kitchens regularly prepared more food than their communities could consume, with the excess specifically intended for distribution to the poor who gathered at their gates. But monastic charity came with its own requirements and limitations. Many religious houses distributed food only at specific times and only to those who demonstrated appropriate humility and gratitude. Some required those seeking aid to participate in prayers or religious instruction, viewing charity as an opportunity for spiritual education as well as material assistance. Others limited their aid to certain categories of poor, local residents rather than wandering strangers, or women and children rather than able-bodied men who might be expected to work for their sustenance. The Church's teaching about charity created both opportunities and complications for beggars. While Christian doctrine strongly encouraged almsgiving, it also distinguished between worthy and unworthy recipients. The truly deserving poor, widows, orphans, the aged and infirm, were seen as clear objects of Christian compassion, but able-bodied beggars, particularly those who seemed to prefer asking for charity to seeking work, faced suspicion even from religious authorities who might question whether supporting such people encouraged laziness rather than virtue. Church officials often found themselves balancing competing obligations, the Christian duty to feed the hungry against concerns about encouraging dependency, the desire to support local community members against wariness of traveling beggars who might strain resources, the theological importance of charity against practical worries about maintaining order and preventing disruption of religious services. During religious festivals and holy seasons, the Church's emphasis on charity intensified, creating periods of relative abundance for those who depended on almsgiving. Lent, in particular, was a time when the faithful were encouraged to increase their charitable giving as part of their spiritual preparation for Easter. Christmas, Easter, and various saints' feast days brought special distributions of food and coins, often organized by church authorities and funded by donations from wealthy parishioners. These seasonal variations in charitable activity created cycles that experienced beggars learned to anticipate and plan for. The weeks before major religious holidays might bring increased generosity as people prepared their consciences for important observances, while the periods immediately after such celebrations often saw reduced charity as individuals felt they had fulfilled their religious obligations for the time being. The church also provided practical services beyond simple food and coin distribution. Many religious institutions maintained hospices, simple shelters where travelers and the poor could find basic lodging, usually for a limited time and often in exchange for participation in religious observances. These hospices offered not just physical shelter, but also access to medical care, as many religious communities included members with knowledge of healing herbs and basic medical treatment. Some churches maintained registries of the local poor, attempting to distinguish between long-time community members who had fallen on hard times and traveling beggars who might be seeking to take advantage of local charity. These lists helped ensure that aid went to those most deserving, while also preventing the same individuals from receiving duplicate assistance from multiple religious institutions. The market square pulsed with life from dawn until dusk, a convergence of commerce, community, and human need that made it both a natural gathering place for beggars and a space where their presence created complex social dynamics. Here, where merchants displayed their wares, customers haggled over prices, and coins changed hands in endless small transactions. Those with nothing to sell but their need positioned themselves carefully in the spaces between legitimate commerce and the flow of daily life. The geography of a medieval market was carefully organized, with different trades occupying traditional areas: bakers near the church where their guild had negotiated privileges, butchers in sections where blood and waste could be more easily managed, cloth merchants in covered areas where their valuable goods were protected from rain and sun. Within this organized commercial space, beggars found their own geography, claiming spots that offered the best access to potential benefactors while avoiding interference with the serious business of trade. The edges of the market square provided the most promising territory, close enough to the action to encounter people with money, far enough from the main flow of commerce to avoid accusations of disrupting business. The steps of public buildings, the spaces near wells where people paused to rest, the areas around taverns where merchants might celebrate successful deals, these became the preferred stations for those seeking charity. Timing mattered as much as location. The early morning hours, when farmers arrived with fresh produce and the first customers of the day made their purchases, offered opportunities to approach people whose purses were still full and whose spirits might be generous. But competition was fierce during these prime hours, and the most advantageous positions often went to those who had established some informal claim through long presence or local connections. The relationship between beggars and merchants was delicate and often tense. Shopkeepers and traders understood that the presence of beggars was part of the natural order of things. Christian teaching demanded charity, and market squares had always attracted those seeking help. But merchants also worried that too many beggars might make customers uncomfortable, that aggressive panhandling might drive away business, or that the presence of the obviously poor might remind potential buyers too forcefully of their own economic vulnerabilities. Some merchants developed ongoing relationships with particular beggars, offering regular small amounts of food or coin in exchange for services like watching their stalls during brief absences or sweeping the area in front of their shops. These arrangements provided beggars with more reliable support while giving merchants a way to fulfill their charitable obligations without encouraging a crowd of supplicants that might complicate their business operations. Market days brought special opportunities and challenges. When farmers from the surrounding countryside converged on the town square with their produce, the increased activity created more potential encounters with people who might offer charity. But market days also attracted beggars from other areas, increasing competition and sometimes leading to territorial disputes over the most promising locations. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life shaped the flow of charity in market squares. Harvest time might bring increased generosity as farmers celebrated successful crops and merchants anticipated good profits from the abundant produce. But the lean months of late winter and early spring, when stored food ran low and prices rose, saw decreased charitable giving as everyone felt the pinch of scarcity. Taverns presented their own particular opportunities for those seeking charity. The establishments where merchants and travelers gathered to drink, eat, and conduct business were places where successful transactions might loosen purse strings and where the combination of alcohol and good fellowship could inspire generosity. But tavern keepers were often protective of their establishments' reputations and might move along beggars whose presence they felt interfered with the comfortable atmosphere their paying customers expected. The evening hours, when the day's trading was done and people gathered for food and drink, could be especially profitable for beggars who had learned to judge the mood of potential benefactors. A merchant celebrating a successful day might be more inclined to share his good fortune, while someone who had suffered losses might be less receptive to appeals for help. Children proved particularly effective at soliciting charity in market settings, their obvious vulnerability touching hearts that might be hardened against adult beggars. But the use of children in begging also raised moral questions that troubled medieval consciences. Was it appropriate for adults to send children to seek charity, even if those children were genuinely in need? These ethical concerns sometimes led to restrictions on child begging or efforts to provide alternative support for families with young children. The sounds of the market provided a constant backdrop to the quieter drama of charity seeking. The calls of merchants advertising their wares, the haggling voices of buyers and sellers, the creak of cart wheels, and the lowing of livestock all mixed with the softer sounds of beggars making their appeals. In this cacophony of commerce and human activity, the art of seeking charity required finding ways to be heard without being intrusive, to be present without being disruptive. Within the crowded spaces where commerce and charity intersected, medieval society wrestled with fundamental questions about human worth, social responsibility, and the proper ordering of community life, questions that were never fully resolved but were negotiated daily in countless small interactions between those who had and those who needed. In the minds of medieval people, the figure of the beggar evoked a complex mixture of emotions that reflected deeper uncertainties about poverty, virtue, and social order. While Christian teaching clearly commanded charity toward the poor, daily experience of begging and beggars often complicated these religious imperatives with practical concerns, moral questions, and social anxieties that were not easily resolved through theological instruction alone. The most sympathetic view of beggars saw them as opportunities for spiritual growth, living reminders of Christ's teaching that the poor were blessed and that serving them was serving God Himself. This perspective encouraged people to see beyond the ragged clothing and extended hands to recognize fellow human beings deserving of compassion and aid. Stories circulated of saints who had appeared as beggars to test the charity of the faithful, and these tales reinforced the idea that every act of giving might be observed and rewarded by divine authority. Yet alongside this charitable impulse ran a persistent current of suspicion and moral judgment. Medieval society placed enormous value on work, seeing labor as both a practical necessity and a moral obligation. Those who appeared capable of working, but chose instead to seek charity, challenged fundamental assumptions about the proper ordering of social life. Were such people genuinely unable to find work, or were they simply unwilling to accept the discipline and constraints that regular employment required? This suspicion was intensified by the mobility of many beggars. Medieval society was organized around fixed relationships: peasant to lord, craftsman to guild, citizen to town. People who wandered from place to place, owing allegiance to no community and contributing to no established social structure, seemed to threaten the stability on which everyone else's security depended. Traveling beggars might be carrying diseases, might be criminals fleeing justice, or might be spies gathering information for hostile forces. The distinction between local and foreign beggars became crucial in determining community responses. Someone known to have fallen on hard times through recognizable misfortune, crop failure, illness, or the death of a provider, could expect more sympathetic treatment than strangers whose circumstances were unknown. and whose presence might strain limited charitable resources. Local beggars were part of the community's responsibility, but traveling beggars represented claims on charity that might not be reciprocated if local people found themselves in need while traveling elsewhere. Gender added another layer of complexity to attitudes toward begging. Women beggars often evoked more sympathy than men, particularly if they had children with them, because medieval society recognized that women had fewer opportunities for independent survival. A widow with young children represented the kind of deserving poor that Christian teaching most clearly embraced. But women beggars also faced unique suspicions about their moral character, about the circumstances that had led to their destitution, and about whether their presence might attract undesirable behavior from men. The physical appearance of beggars became a kind of text that observers constantly tried to read for clues about worthiness and authenticity. Visible signs of illness or disability generally evoked sympathy and were seen as clear evidence of genuine need. But beggars who appeared healthy and capable of work faced skeptical questions about why they were not supporting themselves through labor rather than charity. This scrutiny led some beggars to emphasize or even exaggerate their physical limitations, creating a disturbing dynamic in which genuine suffering became a kind of currency in the economy of charity. The truly disabled might find themselves competing for sympathy with those who feigned or enhanced their afflictions, while those whose limitations were not visible, chronic illness, mental distress, or simply the weakness that came from prolonged malnutrition, struggled to demonstrate their worthiness for aid. Religious authorities attempted to provide guidance for distinguishing between worthy and unworthy recipients of charity, but their teachings often reflected the same ambivalences that troubled laypeople. Sermons praised generosity while warning against encouraging laziness, encouraged compassion while acknowledging the practical limitations of charitable resources. The result was a moral framework that offered general principles but left individuals to make difficult judgments about specific cases. These judgments were complicated by the performance aspects of begging. Effective charity seeking required presenting oneself in ways that would evoke sympathy and generosity, but this theatrical element could make it difficult to distinguish between genuine need and calculated manipulation. Someone who had become skilled at appealing for charity might appear more needy than someone who was actually more desperate but less experienced in presenting their case. The seasonal and cyclical nature of medieval economic life also shaped attitudes toward begging. During times of relative abundance, after good harvests, or during prosperous trading seasons, charitable giving might be more generous and judgments of beggars more lenient. But during periods of scarcity, when everyone felt economic pressure, tolerance for those who seemed to be choosing dependency over self-reliance could diminish sharply. These shifting attitudes created an environment in which beggars had to be constantly attentive to social moods and community sentiments. Success in seeking charity required not just presenting one's own case effectively, but reading the broader social and economic climate that would determine how receptive potential benefactors might be to appeals for help. As medieval Europe grew more organized and centralized, the informal systems of charity that had long supported the destitute began to be supplemented and sometimes replaced by formal legal structures designed to manage the social challenges that poverty created. The development of laws governing begging reflected both genuine concern for social order and growing anxiety about the mobility and perceived threat of wandering poor populations. The earliest attempts to regulate begging focused on distinguishing between local and foreign poor, with communities taking responsibility for their own destitute while attempting to limit their obligations towards strangers. Town councils and royal authorities began requiring beggars to carry documentation proving their place of origin and the legitimacy of their need, creating early forms of identification that would allow communities to support their own poor, while directing others to return to their home areas for assistance. These identification requirements created immediate hardships for those whose destitution had resulted from the destruction of their home communities or who had been traveling when disaster struck. Someone fleeing from war, plague, or famine might have no community to return to, yet would be viewed with suspicion in any new location they entered. The legal requirement to remain in one's place of origin for charitable support could trap people in areas where survival was impossible while preventing them from seeking help elsewhere. As these systems developed, they began to criminalize certain forms of begging while attempting to provide legitimate alternatives for the deserving poor. Laws distinguished between those who were genuinely unable to work, the aged, disabled, and sick, and those who were deemed capable of labor but unwilling to seek it. The former were granted licenses to beg within specific areas, while the latter faced punishment that might include imprisonment, physical punishment, or forced labor. The enforcement of these laws required local officials to make complex judgments about individual cases, determining who qualified for legitimate charity and who should be compelled to work or punished for refusing employment. These decisions often reflected local prejudices and economic conditions rather than consistent application of legal principles, creating a patchwork of enforcement that varied dramatically from place to place and time to time. Punishment for unlicensed begging could be severe, reflecting both the desire to maintain social order and the belief that harsh consequences might deter people from choosing begging over work. Whipping, branding, and imprisonment were common penalties, while repeat offenders might face mutilation or even execution. These harsh punishments reflected a hardening of attitudes toward poverty that saw begging not as a response to economic necessity, but as a moral failing that threatened social stability. The workhouse system began to emerge as an alternative to both unlimited charity and purely punitive approaches to poverty. These institutions, often run by religious organizations or municipal authorities, offered basic food and shelter in exchange for labor, attempting to address both the immediate needs of the poor and the social concern about supporting those who were unwilling to work. However, conditions in workhouses were deliberately harsh, designed to make them less attractive than independent employment, while still providing survival-level support. Women and children faced particular challenges under these evolving legal systems. Laws often failed to account for the limited employment opportunities available to women, especially those with young children, while the punishment systems designed primarily for adult men could be devastating when applied to families. Some jurisdictions developed separate provisions for women and children, but these were inconsistent and often inadequate to address their specific vulnerabilities. The licensing systems that emerged created new forms of social hierarchy within beggar communities. Those who obtained official permission to seek charity gained a kind of legitimacy that protected them from punishment while potentially providing access to organized charitable distributions. But licensed beggars often faced restrictions on where and when they could seek help, and the licensing process itself could be corrupted by local officials who demanded bribes or favored certain applicants over others. These legal developments also created new relationships between religious and secular authorities over the management of poverty. While the Church maintained its theological commitment to charity, secular governments increasingly took control of practical poverty management, sometimes creating conflicts between religious teachings about universal compassion and legal requirements for documented worthiness. The mobility restrictions that accompanied many begging laws had profound effects on labor markets and social relationships. By requiring people to remain in their places of origin for charitable support, these laws could trap workers in areas where employment opportunities were limited, while preventing them from seeking better prospects elsewhere. This legal immobility served the interests of landowners who wanted to maintain stable labor supplies, but it could perpetuate poverty by preventing people from adapting to changing economic conditions. Enforcement of these laws required extensive administrative systems that were expensive to maintain and difficult to implement consistently. The need to verify identities, track movements, and distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate cases of need created bureaucratic challenges that stretched the limited governmental resources of medieval communities. In the margins of medieval society, where formal structures of family, guild, and feudal obligation could not reach, there developed informal networks of mutual support that sustained life in circumstances that would otherwise have been impossible to survive. The Brotherhood of the Roads was not an official organization, but a loose collection of relationships, shared knowledge, and unspoken codes that enabled those with nothing to help each other endure. These relationships often began with the simple recognition that survival was more likely in groups than in isolation. A lone beggar faced not only the challenges of finding food and shelter, but also the dangers of traveling unprotected through territories where strangers might be viewed as threats or opportunities for exploitation. 2 or 3 people traveling together could watch each other's backs, share information about promising locations for charity, and provide companionship that made the psychological burden of destitution more bearable. The knowledge that sustained these informal communities was passed along through conversations around shared fires or in the sheltered spaces where beggars gathered when weather made travel impossible. Information about which religious houses provided regular charity, which towns were hospitable to strangers, which routes were safest for travel. This intelligence was valuable enough to be shared carefully, usually with those who had proven themselves trustworthy through demonstrated reciprocity and mutual aid. Seasonal patterns shaped these relationships, as the approach of winter drove people to seek more permanent shelter while the return of spring scattered them again along the roads. During the cold months, groups might gather in abandoned buildings, caves, or the outskirts of towns, pooling resources and sharing whatever food or fuel they could obtain. These temporary communities developed their own social structures, with leadership often falling to those with experience, local knowledge, or particular skills that benefited the group. The sharing of food represented both practical necessity and moral imperative within these communities. When someone managed to obtain more food than they could consume immediately, through successful begging, charitable distribution, or occasional work, the expectation was that the surplus would be shared with others who had been less fortunate. This redistribution system helped ensure that everyone survived the inevitable fluctuations in individual success while creating bonds of obligation and reciprocity that strengthened group cohesion. Skills and services were also shared within these communities. Someone with experience in basic medical care might tend to injuries and illnesses using whatever herbs or treatments they could manage with limited resources. Those with particular knowledge of crafts might help others repair clothing or equipment. People with better speaking skills might negotiate with potential benefactors on behalf of those who were too shy, too proud, or too foreign to make effective appeals themselves. The protection that groups could provide was both physical and social. Traveling together reduced the risk of robbery or assault, while the presence of witnesses could protect individuals from false accusations of theft or other crimes. Groups could also provide testimony about each other's character and circumstances, which might be valuable when dealing with authorities who were suspicious of solitary wanderers. But these protective relationships came with their own complications and limitations. Groups of beggars were often viewed with more suspicion than individuals, seen as potential sources of disorder or as organized criminal enterprises. Towns that might tolerate 1 or 2 beggars seeking charity could become hostile when faced with larger groups that might strain local resources or create public disturbances. Leadership within these informal communities was fluid and situational, often based on specific knowledge or capabilities rather than permanent authority. Someone familiar with a particular region might lead during travel through that area, while another person might take charge when the group needed to negotiate with religious or secular authorities. This flexibility helped prevent the kinds of power struggles that could destroy groups whose survival depended on cooperation. Women in these communities faced particular challenges and developed their own strategies for protection and survival. Traveling alone was especially dangerous for women, making group membership almost essential, but joining groups dominated by men created its own risks and complications. Some women formed their own small groups, often centered around shared caregiving responsibilities for children or elderly members, while others found protection by taking on specialized roles within mixed groups. The temporary nature of most of these relationships reflected the underlying instability of life on the margins of medieval society. Groups formed, dissolved, and reformed as people died, found better circumstances, or simply decided to try their luck elsewhere. The bonds that developed were often intense but brief, marked by genuine affection and mutual dependence that might end abruptly when circumstances changed. Children learned the arts of survival and the ethics of mutual aid within these communities, acquiring skills and knowledge that prepared them for lives that formal medieval society had no place for. But they also learned patterns of mobility and dependence that could make it difficult to transition into more settled forms of life. even when opportunities arose. These informal networks created a kind of alternative society with its own values, customs, and ways of understanding the world, existing parallel to but largely separate from the official structures of medieval life, while providing for needs that those official structures could not or would not address. Among the most heartbreaking figures in the landscape of medieval poverty were the children whose small forms could be seen extending tiny hands toward passing strangers, their young voices adding a particularly poignant note to the daily chorus of appeals for charity that echoed through the streets and squares of every town and city. These children of hunger represented both the most vulnerable members of society and, paradoxically, often the most effective seekers of charity, as their obvious innocence and need could touch hearts that had grown hardened to adult suffering. Child beggars came to the streets through various tragic pathways. Some were orphans whose parents had died from disease, accident, or the violence that periodically swept through medieval communities, leaving children with no family network capable of supporting them. Others had been abandoned by families so desperately poor that they could not feed all their children, forced to choose between watching their offspring starve or hoping they might survive on their own. Still others traveled with adult relatives, elderly grandparents, disabled parents, or siblings barely older than themselves, in family groups that had fallen completely outside the systems of support that sustained most people in medieval society. The appearance of these child beggars told immediate stories of privation and need. Their clothing, often adult garments cut down or simply worn oversized, hung loosely on frames diminished by chronic hunger. Their faces, marked by the peculiar combination of premature wisdom and persistent innocence that comes from early exposure to adult struggles, could communicate need more effectively than any words. Their hands, extended in the universal gesture of supplication, seemed smaller and more fragile than adult hands, creating an immediate emotional impact on potential benefactors. The daily routine of child beggars followed patterns similar to those of adults, but with additional vulnerabilities and different strategies. Children could position themselves in places where adults might be moved along by authorities, near church doors during services, in market squares during busy periods, outside the homes of known charitable families. Their presence was often tolerated where adult beggars might face suspicion or hostility, as children were generally seen as less threatening and more deserving of compassion. But this same vulnerability that made children effective at soliciting charity also exposed them to dangers that adult beggars could better defend against. Children traveling alone or in small groups were vulnerable to exploitation by adults, who might use them for begging while keeping any proceeds for themselves. They were also targets for those who might abuse them sexually or physically, taking advantage of their desperation and isolation from any protective authority. The seasonal rhythms that shaped all medieval life had particular impact on child beggars. Winter brought increased danger, as small bodies were less able to withstand cold and exposure than adult frames. Children's higher metabolic needs meant they suffered more quickly from inadequate food, while their smaller size made them more vulnerable to being overlooked when charity was distributed. Yet winter also sometimes brought increased sympathy from potential benefactors who were moved by the sight of obviously suffering children. Some child beggars developed sophisticated strategies for survival that demonstrated remarkable intelligence and adaptability. They learned to read the signs of generosity in potential benefactors, to time their appeals for maximum effectiveness, and to present themselves in ways that emphasized their need while minimizing any threat they might pose. Some became skilled at small performances, singing, dancing, or telling stories that could earn coins while entertaining rather than simply appealing to charity. The relationship between child beggars and religious institutions was often more supportive than the sometimes ambivalent attitude toward adult beggars. Monasteries and churches frequently maintained special provisions for orphaned or abandoned children, offering not just immediate charity but sometimes longer-term support, including basic education and training in useful skills. Some religious communities saw the care of orphan children as a particular spiritual calling, establishing institutions specifically dedicated to their support. But even religious charity for children came with limitations and conditions. Many institutions could support only a limited number of children, and had to make difficult choices about which cases were most deserving or most likely to benefit from assistance. Some required children to participate in religious instruction or to commit to eventual religious vocations in exchange for support, while others focused their aid on children from local communities rather than traveling orphans. The psychological impact of begging on children was profound and lasting. Children who spent their formative years seeking charity learned to see the world as divided between those who had power to help or refuse help and those who depended on the kindness of others for survival. This perspective could shape their understanding of human relationships, social obligations, and their own worth in ways that persisted even if their material circumstances later improved. Some child beggars were absorbed into the informal communities of adult beggars, finding protection and guidance within these marginal societies. Adult beggars often felt particular responsibility for children, sharing food and knowledge while providing whatever protection they could offer. But these relationships could also be exploitative, with adults using children's greater success at soliciting charity while providing minimal care in return. The presence of child beggars in medieval communities created moral challenges that were never fully resolved. While Christian teaching clearly mandated care for orphans and vulnerable children, the practical resources available for such care were always limited. Communities had to balance their obligations to local children against the claims of traveling orphans, their desire to help against concerns about encouraging the abandonment of children by families who found them burdensome. The fate of child beggars who survived to adulthood varied widely. Some managed to transition into more stable forms of life, finding employment, marriage, or other means of integration into settled communities. Others continued in patterns of mobility and dependency that they had learned as children, remaining on the margins of society throughout their lives. Still others died young, victims of the diseases, accidents, and violence that claimed disproportionate numbers of those living without adequate shelter, nutrition, or protection. In the complex religious landscape of medieval Europe, the lines between pilgrim and beggar often blurred until they became nearly indistinguishable, creating a category of people whose spiritual journeys provided both motivation and legitimacy for lives that depended entirely on the charity of strangers. The figure of the pilgrim, beggar represented one of the few socially acceptable forms of voluntary poverty in medieval society, transforming what might otherwise be seen as suspicious vagrancy into a recognized form of religious devotion. Pilgrimage had deep roots in Christian tradition, with believers traveling to holy sites to seek spiritual benefits, forgiveness of sins, miraculous healing, or simply the religious merit that came from enduring hardship in service of faith. The great pilgrimage routes of medieval Europe, to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome in Italy, Canterbury in England, and Jerusalem in the Holy Land, carried thousands of travelers each year, creating infrastructure of hostels, charitable institutions, and support systems designed to assist those making these spiritual journeys. The transformation of pilgrim into beggar often began with good intentions and adequate resources. A merchant or craftsman might set out for a distant shrine with sufficient money for the journey, planning to rely on the established network of pilgrim hostels and charitable institutions that lined the major routes. But illness, robbery, or simply the greater expense and longer duration of pilgrimage than anticipated could leave even well-prepared travelers dependent on charity long before they reached their destinations. For others, pilgrimage offered a dignified alternative to ordinary begging from the outset. Someone who had lost their means of support through economic disaster or family tragedy might undertake a pilgrimage partly from genuine religious motivation and partly because it provided a socially acceptable way to seek charity while traveling in search of better circumstances. The pilgrim staff and scrip traveling bag became symbols that marked their bearer as worthy of charitable support, transforming the extended hand from a sign of personal failure into evidence of spiritual commitment. The clothing and equipment of pilgrims created a visual language that distinguished them from ordinary beggars while justifying their dependence on charity. The wide, brimmed hat that protected against sun and rain, the staff that aided walking on rough roads, the scrip for carrying provisions, and often some symbol of their destination, a shell for those traveling to Santiago, a palm for Jerusalem pilgrims, or a badge from an intermediate shrine, all marked their bearers as engaged in legitimate spiritual enterprise rather than simple vagrancy. This pilgrim identity provided protection and support that was unavailable to ordinary beggars. Pilgrim hostels were required to provide basic food and shelter to genuine pilgrims, while church authorities along pilgrimage routes took special responsibility for assisting travelers who could demonstrate their spiritual purposes. The badges and symbols that pilgrims collected at various shrines served as a kind of passport, providing evidence of their legitimate status and their progress along recognized holy routes. But the same symbols that provided protection could also be counterfeited or acquired through trade rather than genuine pilgrimage, leading to suspicions about whether particular individuals were authentic pilgrims or simply beggars using religious pretense to improve their prospects for charity. Church authorities developed various methods for testing the authenticity of pilgrims, asking detailed questions about their routes, destinations, and religious motivations that genuine pilgrims would be expected to know. The seasonal patterns of pilgrimage created opportunities and challenges for those who depended on this form of charity. Spring and summer brought increased numbers of pilgrims to the roads, creating more competition for charitable resources, but also more opportunities to join traveling groups that provided mutual protection and support. The winter months, when few people undertook long-distance travel, could leave beggars more isolated and more obviously dependent on local charity rather than support specifically intended for religious travelers. Some individuals made pilgrimage a permanent way of life, moving continuously between different holy sites and living entirely on the charity provided to religious travelers. These perpetual pilgrims occupied an ambiguous social position. Their commitment to spiritual seeking was often genuine, but their lifestyle raised questions about whether they were fulfilling the spiritual purposes of pilgrimage or simply using religious institutions to support what was essentially professional begging. The relationship between pilgrimage and penance created another category of pilgrim, beggars, those who had been sentenced by church courts to undertake specific pilgrimages as punishment for sins or crimes. These judicial pilgrims were required to visit particular shrines and return with proof of their completion of the assigned penance, but their journeys might take months or years and leave them completely dependent on charity during the entire period. Women faced particular challenges as beggars, as solitary female travel was viewed with suspicion in medieval society. Women pilgrims often traveled in groups or attached themselves to larger pilgrimages for protection. But those who found themselves alone and dependent on charity faced questions about their moral character that male pilgrims rarely encountered. The religious motivation that provided legitimacy for male beggars might not be sufficient to protect women from accusations of improper behavior or ulterior motives. The destinations of pilgrimage also influenced the treatment received by beggars. Those traveling to the most prestigious sites, Jerusalem, Rome, Santiago, commanded greater respect and more generous charity than those visiting local or less renowned shrines. The distance and difficulty of the journey became a measure of spiritual commitment that influenced how potential benefactors responded to requests for aid. As pilgrimage routes became more established and institutionalized, they also became more regulated, with church authorities attempting to distinguish between genuine religious travelers and those who might be exploiting the charitable systems intended to support them. This regulation created new bureaucratic requirements for pilgrims while potentially making it more difficult for those who had genuinely fallen into destitution during their travels to receive the support they needed. In the rich tapestry of medieval literature and oral tradition, beggars occupied a complex symbolic space that reflected society's ambivalent attitudes toward poverty, charity, and social order. The stories told about beggars in sermons from church pulpits, in the narrative cycles that traveling entertainers carried from town to town, and in the moral exemplar that educated people used to illustrate proper Christian behavior, revealed deep cultural anxieties about wealth, worthiness, and the proper ordering of human society. Perhaps the most powerful and recurring theme in medieval beggar stories was the motif of the saint or divine figure in disguise, testing the charity of ordinary mortals through appeals for aid. These tales drew inspiration from biblical stories of angels appearing as strangers in need of hospitality, but they adapted these themes to address specifically medieval concerns about the proper response to begging. In these stories, a seemingly ordinary beggar would approach various members of a community seeking help, receiving different responses that revealed the spiritual condition of each person approached. The typical structure of such tales involved the beggar being turned away by the wealthy and powerful, merchants who claimed poverty while living in luxury, nobles who justified their refusal through elaborate explanations of their responsibilities to their own households, clergy who cited institutional obligations while ignoring individual compassion. Meanwhile, the poorest members of the community, often people who were themselves struggling to survive, would share their meager resources with the stranger, sometimes giving away their last piece of bread or offering shelter in their humble homes. The revelation that typically concluded such stories would expose the beggar as a saint, an angel, or even Christ himself, leading to rewards for those who had shown charity and punishment for those who had refused aid. These tales served multiple functions in medieval culture. They encouraged charitable giving by suggesting that any beggar might be a divine test. They provided comfort to the poor by suggesting that their generosity was particularly valued by God. And they offered warnings to the wealthy about the spiritual dangers of ignoring those in need. But medieval beggar stories also included cautionary tales about false beggars and the dangers of misplaced charity. These narratives reflected genuine social concerns about professional beggars who might exploit charitable impulses while avoiding honest work. Stories circulated about able-bodied men who feigned disability to increase their success at soliciting alms, women who borrowed or rented children to appear more deserving of charity, and organized groups of beggars who operated sophisticated schemes to defraud the generous. The figure of the trickster beggar appeared frequently in medieval folk tales and moral stories, often as a character who exposed the pretensions and hypocrisies of established society while pursuing his own survival through wit rather than honest labor. These characters occupied an ambiguous moral space. Their deceptions were clearly wrong according to conventional morality, but their targets were often people whose own behavior was open to criticism, and their cleverness could be admired even when their methods were condemned. Medieval romance literature often featured beggars as figures who provided tests or assistance to questing knights, serving as sources of information, guidance, or moral instruction. In these narratives, the beggar's lowly status paradoxically gave them access to knowledge and wisdom that was unavailable to those of higher rank. The knight who treated beggars with courtesy and generosity would receive aid that proved crucial to his success, while those who ignored or mistreated the poor would find their quests complicated by the lack of support from those they had scorned. Religious drama and moral plays frequently included beggar characters as representatives of the deserving poor who merited charitable support. These theatrical beggars were typically portrayed as patient, humble, and grateful, serving as positive examples of how poverty should be borne and how charity should be received. Their presence in religious drama reinforced the theological importance of almsgiving while providing models of appropriate behavior for both givers and receivers of charity. The literary tradition also preserved stories of historical or legendary figures who had chosen voluntary poverty and lived as beggars for spiritual reasons. Saints who had renounced wealth and worldly position to live in imitation of Christ's poverty provided inspiring examples of how begging could represent spiritual rather than social failure. These stories helped distinguish between involuntary poverty that merited sympathy and chosen poverty that commanded respect and admiration. Folk tales often featured magical beggars whose supernatural powers allowed them to reward generosity and punish stinginess in dramatic and memorable ways. These stories served both entertainment and educational functions, using fantastic elements to make moral points about charitable obligations more memorable and compelling. The magical abilities of these fictional beggars reflected cultural beliefs about the special relationship between the poor and the divine, suggesting that God might work through the least powerful members of society to accomplish his purposes. Chronicle and historical writing occasionally preserved accounts of actual beggars whose stories had captured popular attention or illustrated particular points about social conditions. These historical narratives might describe former nobles reduced to begging through political reversals, foreign refugees seeking charity, after fleeing from wars or natural disasters, or local people whose falls from prosperity had become matters of community concern and discussion. The medieval tradition of exemplary literature, collections of brief moral stories used by preachers to illustrate religious teachings, included numerous tales about beggars and charity that were designed to influence actual behavior rather than simply entertain. These practical stories focused on realistic situations that audience members might encounter, providing guidance about how to distinguish between worthy and unworthy recipients of aid while encouraging general charitable attitudes. Even satirical literature found rich material in the figure of the beggar, using the contrast between appearance and reality, between claimed need and actual condition, to comment on broader social hypocrisies and pretensions. These satirical treatments often revealed genuine social tensions about poverty and charity, while using humor to make critical observations about human nature and social organization. As the light fades on these medieval streets and the shadows deepen around the figures who once sought charity at every corner and church door, we are left to contemplate the faces that have long since disappeared into the anonymity of history, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their passage through a world that knew them primarily as recipients of reluctant generosity or objects of uncomfortable moral obligation. The beggar's life was one of constant motion between hope and disappointment, between the possibility of kindness and the reality of indifference, measured not in the grand events that chronicle the lives of kings and nobles, but in the small transactions of daily survival: a piece of bread accepted with gratitude, a coin dropped into an outstretched palm, a night's shelter found in the lee of a church wall. These modest victories and frequent defeats accumulated into lifetimes that were perhaps no less meaningful for being largely unrecorded. In attempting to understand what it meant to live as a beggar in medieval Europe, we encounter the fundamental paradox of historical inquiry into the lives of the powerless. Those whose experiences we most need to understand left the fewest records of their own voices and perspectives. The beggars who populated medieval streets speak to us now only through the accounts of those who observed them, helped them, regulated them, or worried about them, creating a historical record that tells us as much about medieval attitudes toward poverty as it does about the actual experience of being poor. Yet within the gaps and silences of the historical record, we can still discern the outlines of human resilience and adaptation, the ways that people created meaning and maintained dignity even in circumstances that seemed designed to strip both away. The informal communities that formed among beggars, the strategies they developed for survival, the relationships they built with more settled members of society, all of these speak to capacities for hope and ingenuity that persisted even in the most marginal circumstances. The medieval beggar's world was one in which the fundamental assumptions that govern most people's lives, assumptions about family, community, work, and security, had broken down or never existed at all. In this world without certainties, survival required developing alternative forms of knowledge and different ways of understanding social relationships. The beggar learned to read the subtle signs of generosity or hostility in strangers' faces, to judge the likelihood of charity based on clothing, behavior, and circumstance, and to navigate the complex social geography that determined where help might be found and where it would certainly be refused. The seasonal rhythms that shaped all medieval life took on particular intensity for those who had no stored resources to carry them through lean times, no permanent shelter to protect them from winter cold, no established relationships to provide support during illness or injury. For beggars, each change of season brought new challenges and opportunities that required constant adaptation and endless walking between sources of potential aid. Pregnancy and childbirth among female beggars presented particular medical challenges that highlighted the inadequacy of available care for the most vulnerable members of society. Women giving birth without access to skilled midwives, clean environments, or adequate nutrition faced mortality rates that were high even by medieval standards, while infants born into conditions of poverty and instability had reduced chances of survival to adulthood. The care of elderly beggars created additional medical and social challenges within beggar communities. Older individuals who had spent years living rough often developed chronic conditions that made continued mobility difficult, but they also possessed knowledge an experience that could be valuable to younger members of their communities. The tension between caring for elderly community members and maintaining the mobility necessary for survival created difficult decisions that highlighted the inadequacy of medieval society's provisions for aging populations who lacked family support. Dental problems, which were common throughout medieval society, became particularly severe among beggars who lacked access to even the basic dental care that was available to more settled populations. Tooth loss and oral infections could make eating difficult and painful, contributing to malnutrition and making it harder to maintain the kind of appearance that was most effective for soliciting charity. The psychological aspects of illness among beggars were complicated by the social isolation and stress that accompanied life on the margins of medieval society. Depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions could be both causes and consequences of the circumstances that led to begging, creating complex interactions between psychological and physical health that were poorly understood and inadequately addressed by medieval medical knowledge. Some beggars developed remarkable resilience and practical medical knowledge that allowed them to maintain their health despite difficult circumstances, learning to identify and use medicinal plants to treat injuries with whatever materials were available, and to recognize the early signs of serious conditions that required more intensive care. This practical medical knowledge became part of the survival skills that were passed along within beggar communities, contributing to informal educational systems that helped individuals cope with the health challenges that their circumstances created. The social networks that developed among medieval beggars created forms of mutual support and information sharing that were essential for survival in conditions that formal social institutions were unable or unwilling to address. These networks, while informal and constantly shifting, provided resources and services that no individual beggar could have accessed alone, creating communities of care and mutual aid that operated parallel to but largely separate from the official structures of medieval society. The sharing of information represented one of the most valuable services that beggar networks provided to their members. Knowledge about which religious institutions provided regular charity, which towns were hospitable to strangers, which routes were safest for travel, and which officials were likely to be sympathetic rather than hostile could mean the difference between successful survival and dangerous failure. This information was constantly updated and refined through the experiences of network members, creating a dynamic database of practical knowledge that was essential for navigating the complex landscape of medieval charity and social regulation. The geographic scope of these information networks was often surprisingly extensive, as beggars who traveled long distances for seasonal work, pilgrimage, or simply in search of better opportunities carried news and updates between distant communities. A beggar who had spent time in one region could provide valuable intelligence about conditions and opportunities in areas that other network members had never visited, while someone returning from a pilgrimage route could report on changes in charitable provisions or legal restrictions that might affect future travelers. The credibility and reliability of information within these networks was maintained through reputation systems that developed over time as individuals demonstrated the accuracy and usefulness of their reports. Beggars who consistently provided reliable information gained status and influence within their networks, while those who spread false or misleading information found their credibility diminished and their access to valuable intelligence reduced. Economic cooperation within beggar networks took various forms that helped individuals maximize their access to charitable resources while minimizing direct competition among network members. Informal territorial arrangements might divide promising begging locations among network members, reducing conflicts while ensuring that everyone had access to potentially productive areas. Cooperation agreements might involve taking turns at particularly valuable positions, sharing the proceeds from especially successful appeals, or coordinating approaches to potential benefactors to avoid oversaturating charitable sources with too many simultaneous requests. The pooling of resources allowed network members to purchase or obtain items that would have been beyond the reach of individuals acting alone. Clothing, tools, or other equipment that required larger investments could be acquired collectively and shared among network members according to need and availability. Food that was obtained in quantities larger than one person could consume could be distributed among the group, ensuring that temporary abundance benefited as many people as possible while reducing waste. Skill sharing within these networks created informal educational systems that helped individuals develop the capabilities needed for successful survival. Experienced beggars taught newcomers the arts of effective charity solicitation, how to read potential benefactors, how to present appeals most persuasively, how to position oneself advantageously without violating social or legal expectations. Practical skills like mending clothing, constructing temporary shelter, finding and preparing wild foods, and treating basic medical conditions were passed along through demonstration and practice. The emotional and psychological support provided by beggar networks was perhaps as important as the practical assistance they offered. The companionship of others who understood the challenges and indignities of life on society's margins provided validation and encouragement that helped individuals maintain their sense of self-worth despite circumstances that seemed designed to strip away human dignity. Shared stories, jokes, songs, and other forms of social interaction created moments of human connection that provided relief from the isolation and stress that characterized much of beggar life. Protection services within these networks ranged from simple mutual watchfulness to more organized systems of defense against the various threats that beggars faced. Groups traveling together were less likely to be robbed or assaulted than individuals moving alone, while network members could provide witnesses and support when legal problems arose. The presence of allies could also be valuable when dealing with officials or authorities who might be more respectful of groups than of isolated individuals. Conflict resolution mechanisms developed within beggar networks to address the disputes and tensions that inevitably arose when people competed for limited resources while depending on each other for survival. Informal mediation systems, often led by respected elder members of the community, provided ways to resolve disagreements about territory, resources, or behavior without resorting to violence that could attract unwanted attention from authorities or undermine group cohesion. The initiation of new members into beggar networks involved both formal and informal processes that served to transmit essential knowledge while establishing relationships of trust and mutual obligation. Newcomers might be required to demonstrate their reliability and commitment through various forms of service or contribution to the group, while experienced members evaluated their character and potential value as network participants. Communication systems within these networks had to balance the need for effective information sharing with the security requirements that came from operating outside normal legal and social structures. Code words, signs, and other forms of covert communication allowed network members to share sensitive information about opportunities, threats, or official activities without revealing their knowledge to outsiders who might use such information against them. The leadership structures that emerged within beggar networks were typically informal and situational, based on expertise, experience, or personal qualities rather than formal appointment or election. Someone with extensive knowledge of a particular region might take leadership during travel through that area, while another person with medical knowledge might become the authority on health-related decisions. This flexible leadership system allowed networks to adapt to changing circumstances while utilizing the specific strengths of different members. Seasonal variations in network activities reflected the changing opportunities and challenges that different times of year presented. Winter might bring more intensive cooperation as network members pooled resources to survive the harshest months, while spring and summer might see networks dispersing as individuals pursued different strategies for taking advantage of improved conditions. The reunification of networks after periods of separation often involved extensive sharing of experiences and information gained during the time apart. The relationship between beggar networks and settled communities was complex and constantly negotiated, as network members sought to obtain necessary resources from mainstream society while avoiding the kind of attention or interference that might disrupt their operations. Some networks developed ongoing relationships with sympathetic individuals or institutions in settled communities, creating semi-permanent connections that provided stability and predictability in otherwise uncertain circumstances. Gender dynamics within beggar networks reflected the broader gender relations of medieval society, while also adapting to the particular circumstances that network members faced. Women might take on specialized roles within networks that utilized their different relationships with potential benefactors, while also requiring additional protection and support that network membership could provide. The presence of children within networks created additional responsibilities and opportunities that required careful management and coordination among network members. The seasonal migrations and settlement patterns of medieval populations created a complex geography of opportunity and challenge for beggars, whose survival strategies had to account for the constant movement of people, resources, and economic activity across the landscape of medieval Europe. Understanding and adapting to these patterns of mobility and settlement required knowledge that went far beyond simple geographic information, encompassing insights into economic cycles, social customs, legal jurisdictions, and religious observances that varied dramatically from place to place. The agricultural calendar dominated the rhythm of life in most medieval communities, creating predictable patterns of abundance and scarcity that directly affected the availability of charitable resources. Harvest seasons brought temporary prosperity to rural areas as crops were gathered and food became abundant, creating opportunities for beggars to benefit from the increased generosity that often accompanied successful harvests. But the timing of harvests varied by region and crop, requiring careful planning by beggars who hoped to follow the seasonal cycles of agricultural prosperity. The period between harvest and spring planting represented a time of relative abundance in rural communities, when stored grain and preserved foods provided security and farmers might have surplus resources available for charitable giving. But this same period coincided with winter weather that made travel difficult and dangerous, creating tensions between the availability of charity and the ability to reach communities where such charity might be found. Spring planting seasons created different patterns of opportunity and challenge, as agricultural communities focused their resources and attention on the critical work of preparing and planting their fields. While this intensive agricultural activity might create temporary opportunities for paid labor, it also meant that farming families were investing heavily in their future crops and might have fewer current resources available for charitable distribution. Market cycles created additional layers of complexity in the geography of charitable opportunity, as the flow of goods, merchants, and money through commercial centers varied according to seasonal trading patterns, religious festivals, and regional economic conditions. Major trading fairs and markets drew merchants and customers from wide areas, creating temporary concentrations of wealth and commercial activity that could provide exceptional opportunities for beggars who were able to reach these events at the right times. But the success of market-based charity seeking required detailed knowledge of commercial calendars that were often closely guarded by merchant communities and guilds. The dates of major fairs, the types of goods that would be traded, and the probable duration of commercial activities were crucial information that successful beggars had to obtain and update constantly as economic conditions and political circumstances changed. Urban centers presented their own seasonal variations in charitable opportunity that reflected the different economic bases of cities and towns. Craft production, commercial activities, and administrative functions created patterns of prosperity and scarcity that did not always align with agricultural cycles, providing opportunities for beggars who understood urban economic rhythms to find charity when rural resources were less available. The presence of religious institutions created additional geographic patterns that beggars learned to navigate and exploit. Monasteries, cathedrals, and other religious centers maintained their own calendars of charitable distribution that might provide reliable resources regardless of local economic conditions. But access to such charity often required knowledge of religious schedules and customs, and varied significantly between different orders and institutions. Pilgrimage routes created seasonal flows of people and resources that provided opportunities for beggars who positioned themselves strategically along these well-traveled paths. The predictable movement of pilgrims toward major religious destinations created temporary demand for services and charity that experienced beggars could anticipate and prepare for, but competition for positions along popular pilgrimage routes could be intense among those seeking to benefit from pilgrim charity. The legal and jurisdictional complexity of medieval Europe created a patchwork of regulations and enforcement practices that significantly affected the experiences of traveling beggars. Laws regarding vagrancy, begging, and population movement varied dramatically between different kingdoms, duchies, cities, and even smaller administrative units, requiring beggars to maintain current knowledge of legal conditions in different areas while adapting their strategies to comply with local requirements. Border regions between different political jurisdictions often provided both opportunities and dangers for traveling beggars. The confusion and reduced enforcement that sometimes characterized border areas could provide refuge for those fleeing more restrictive legal environments. But the same political instability that created these opportunities could also result in arbitrary enforcement, military activities, or other dangers that made border regions risky places to seek charity. The seasonal movement of courts, administrative officials, and military forces created additional variations in legal enforcement that beggars had to monitor and respond to. A town that might be relatively tolerant of begging during most of the year could become much more restrictive when important officials were present, while areas that were normally well regulated might become more permissive when enforcement authorities were occupied elsewhere. Language and cultural variations across medieval Europe created communication challenges for traveling beggars that could significantly affect their success in different regions. The ability to communicate effectively with potential benefactors was essential for successful charity seeking, but the linguistic diversity of medieval Europe meant that beggars who traveled beyond their home regions often had to develop multilingual capabilities or find other ways to overcome communication barriers. Cultural differences in charitable customs and expectations also required careful attention from beggars who moved between different regions. The forms of address, behavioral expectations, and presentation styles that were effective in one area might be inappropriate or counterproductive in another, requiring constant adaptation and cultural sensitivity that went far beyond simple language skills. Religious variations, while less dramatic than linguistic differences within Christian Europe, still created significant differences in charitable practices and expectations that traveling beggars had to understand and accommodate. The emphasis placed on different forms of charity, the schedules of religious observances, and the relationships between secular and religious authorities varied enough between regions to require local knowledge for effective charity seeking. The physical geography of medieval Europe, mountains, rivers, forests, and other natural features created practical challenges for traveling beggars that affected both their ability to move between different areas and their success in finding charity once they arrived in new locations. Knowledge of safe routes, seasonal hazards, and the locations of shelters and resources along travel routes was essential for successful migration between different areas of opportunity. Weather patterns and seasonal climate variations added another layer of complexity to migration planning, as the same routes that might be easily traveled during favorable weather could become impassable or dangerous during storms, floods, or other adverse conditions. The timing of migrations had to account for both the availability of charitable opportunities at destinations and the practical requirements of safe travel. The development of transportation networks, roads, bridges, river crossings, and other infrastructure affected the patterns of beggar migration by determining which routes were feasible and which destinations were accessible from particular starting points. Changes in transportation infrastructure, whether due to new construction, war damage, or natural disasters, could significantly alter the geography of opportunity for traveling beggars. Information networks among beggars served crucial functions in helping individuals navigate this complex landscape of seasonal and geographic variation. The sharing of current information about conditions, opportunities, and challenges in different areas allowed beggars to make informed decisions about where to travel and when to make such journeys, while also providing updates about changes in local conditions that might affect the success of charity-seeking efforts. The establishment of informal territorial claims and cooperation agreements among beggars helped manage competition for the most promising charitable opportunities, while ensuring that valuable locations were not oversaturated with people seeking help. These arrangements required constant negotiation and adjustment as seasonal patterns changed and new individuals entered or left particular areas. In the complex interplay between formal religious doctrine and everyday practice, Medieval attitudes toward charity revealed deep tensions about the proper relationship between spiritual obligation and practical social management. While Christian teaching unambiguously commanded generous giving to the poor, the actual implementation of charitable practices was complicated by concerns about economic sustainability, social order, and the effectiveness of different approaches to addressing poverty and need. The theological foundation of medieval charity rested on Christ's teachings about the blessed nature of the poor and the spiritual benefits that came from serving those in need. The parable of the sheep and goats, in which salvation was determined by how individuals had treated the hungry, thirsty, naked, and imprisoned, provided clear scriptural support for the idea that charity toward the poor was not optional kindness, but essential Christian duty that would be judged by divine authority. But this theological clarity was complicated by practical questions about how to distinguish between deserving and undeserving recipients of charity, how to provide aid in ways that genuinely helped rather than enabling dependency, and how to balance charitable obligations against other responsibilities to family, community, and social stability. These practical concerns led to the development of complex systems of evaluation and regulation that often seemed to contradict the simple generosity that Christian teaching appeared to require. The medieval church's approach to charity was further complicated by its role as both spiritual teacher and major landowner, creating institutional interests that sometimes conflicted with the radical implications of Christian teachings about poverty and wealth. Monastic communities that had taken vows of poverty often controlled extensive resources, while church hierarchy lived in circumstances that were difficult to reconcile with the humble lifestyle that Christian doctrine seemed to promote. The development of canon law regarding charity attempted to provide systematic approaches to charitable obligation that would address practical concerns while maintaining theological integrity. These legal frameworks established categories of poor people who had different claims on charitable resources, created procedures for evaluating the worthiness of charity recipients, and defined the obligations of different groups within Christian society to provide various forms of assistance to those in need. But the implementation of these canonical requirements often revealed the gap between theoretical obligation and practical capability. Communities that acknowledged their Christian duty to care for the poor might still struggle to provide adequate assistance when the number of needy people exceeded available resources, leading to difficult decisions about rationing charity and prioritizing among competing claims for help. The seasonal and cyclical nature of medieval economic life created additional challenges for implementing consistent charitable practices. Communities that might be generous during times of abundance could become restrictive during periods of scarcity, leading to variations in charitable availability that reflected economic conditions rather than consistent application of Christian principles. Individual Christians faced their own moral challenges in navigating between charitable obligation and personal security. The medieval economy provided little cushion against economic disaster, meaning that generous charity could potentially threaten the giver's own survival if circumstances changed unexpectedly. This tension between Christian generosity and practical prudence led to complex calculations about appropriate levels of charitable giving that varied dramatically among individuals and communities. The relationship between public and private charity created additional complications in medieval charitable practices. While individual Christians had clear obligations to practice personal charity, the development of institutional charitable systems, hospitals, almshouses, and other organized forms of poor relief raised questions about how personal and institutional obligations should be balanced and coordinated. Some argued that the existence of institutional charity reduced individual obligation, allowing people to fulfill their Christian duties through contributions to organized charitable systems rather than direct personal giving. Others maintained that institutional charity, however well organized, could not replace the personal relationships and individual responsibility that authentic Christian charity required. The treatment of different categories of poor people revealed additional tensions in medieval charitable practice. While widows, orphans, and the disabled were generally accepted as deserving recipients of charity, able-bodied beggars faced much more skeptical evaluation that reflected concerns about work, social order, and the proper use of charitable resources. These distinctions between categories of poor people often reflected broader social anxieties about labor, mobility, and social control rather than purely theological considerations. The fear that generous charity toward able-bodied beggars might encourage laziness or social disorder led to charitable practices that were more restrictive than a simple reading of Christian teaching might have suggested. Women's participation in charitable activities was shaped by medieval gender roles that both expanded and limited their involvement in poor relief. Women were often seen as particularly suited to charitable work due to cultural associations between femininity and compassion, but their legal and economic limitations restricted their ability to control significant charitable resources or to participate in the formal institutional structures that managed much medieval charity. Noble and wealthy women often found in charitable activities an outlet for leadership and social influence that was otherwise limited by their gender, creating elaborate systems of personal charity that provided both assistance to the poor and social status for their practitioners. But these individual charitable activities were often limited in scope and sustainability, dependent on the continued interest and resources of particular women rather than integrated into broader social systems of poor relief. The relationship between charity and penance created another layer of complexity in medieval charitable practices. The giving of alms was often prescribed as penance for sins, creating connections between charitable activity and personal spiritual development that could motivate generous giving, while also raising questions about the spiritual authenticity of charity that was performed primarily to satisfy penitential requirements. Charitable activities that were motivated by penitential obligations might be performed grudgingly or with minimal attention to the actual needs of recipients, focusing instead on fulfilling the technical requirements of assigned penances. This tension between charitable obligation and authentic compassion created ongoing debates about the spiritual value of different forms of charitable activity. The development of indulgences as a form of spiritual currency further complicated the relationship between charity and authentic religious motivation. The possibility of purchasing spiritual benefits through charitable donations created market-like mechanisms for poor relief that could provide substantial resources for charitable institutions, while raising questions about whether such commodified charity fulfilled the authentic Christian obligations that had originally motivated charitable requirements. Urban commercial development created new forms of wealth that challenged traditional approaches to charity and poor relief. Merchant families and craft guilds developed resources and social influence that allowed them to establish charitable institutions and practices that were more systematic and better funded than traditional forms of individual charity. But these new approaches to poor relief often reflected commercial values and organizational methods that were not always compatible with traditional Christian approaches to charity. The increasing sophistication of urban charitable institutions created more effective and reliable systems of poor relief in many communities, but these institutional approaches to charity also created new forms of bureaucracy and regulation that could make charitable assistance less personal and more conditional than traditional forms of individual giving had been. As medieval society developed more complex economic and social structures, the simple Christian commandment to give generously to the poor became embedded in increasingly elaborate systems of evaluation, regulation, and institutional management that often seemed to contradict the spirit of spontaneous compassion that had originally motivated Christian charitable requirements. The winter mortality among medieval beggars represented one of the starkest realities of life on the margins of society, as each cold season brought a predictable harvest of death that reduced the population of those seeking charity, while serving as a harsh reminder of the ultimate consequences of social and economic exclusion. The approach of winter created a cruel form of natural selection among beggar populations, where those who had acquired the skills, knowledge, and resources necessary for survival would endure until spring, while those who lacked these advantages would simply disappear into the anonymous ranks of the forgotten dead. The causes of winter death among beggars were multiple and often interacted in ways that made survival increasingly difficult as the season progressed. Simple exposure to cold, while dramatic and immediate in its effects, was often less important than the gradual weakening that came from inadequate nutrition, chronic illness, and the accumulated stress of trying to survive in conditions that human bodies were not designed to endure for extended periods. Hypothermia, the medical condition in which body temperature drops below the level necessary to maintain normal biological functions, was probably the most common direct cause of death among beggars during winter months. But the development of hypothermia was usually the final stage in a longer process of decline that began with inadequate clothing, insufficient food, and the inability to maintain consistent access to warm shelter. The medieval understanding of cold-related death was limited by the lack of systematic medical knowledge about the physiological processes involved in temperature regulation and the effects of prolonged cold exposure. Deaths that modern medicine would attribute to hypothermia were often explained in medieval contexts through religious or moral frameworks that saw such deaths as divine judgment, personal failure, or simply the natural consequence of a lifestyle that was inherently unsustainable. Starvation during winter months was often a more gradual process than exposure, but it was no less deadly for those who could not obtain adequate nutrition during the months when food was scarce and expensive. The combination of reduced charitable giving during winter months and increased caloric requirements for maintaining body temperature in cold conditions created a nutritional crisis for many beggars that could prove fatal even when adequate shelter was available. The physiological effects of chronic malnutrition made beggars more vulnerable to the diseases and infections that circulated through medieval communities during winter months. Bodies weakened by inadequate nutrition had reduced ability to fight off respiratory infections, digestive disorders, and other illnesses that might have been survivable under better circumstances. Respiratory diseases, in particular, claimed many beggar lives during winter months as the combination of cold air, inadequate shelter, and weakened immune systems created ideal conditions for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other lung infections to develop and progress rapidly to fatal conclusions. The crowded conditions in which beggars often sought shelter during cold weather facilitated the transmission of contagious diseases while making it difficult for sick individuals to obtain the rest and care they needed for recovery. The lack of medical care available to beggars meant that treatable conditions often became fatal simply because appropriate treatment was not available or affordable. Infections that might have been manageable with proper care could progress to sepsis and death, while injuries that became infected due to inadequate cleaning and dressing could develop into life-threatening conditions. The psychological factors that contributed to winter mortality among beggars were often overlooked by contemporary observers, but were probably significant contributors to the high death rates that characterized these populations during cold months. Depression, despair, and the simple exhaustion that came from constant struggle could reduce individuals' motivation and energy for the activities necessary for survival, creating a form of passive suicide that was rarely recognized or addressed. The social dynamics of winter survival among beggar populations created additional factors that influenced mortality rates. Competition for limited shelter and resources could lead to conflicts that resulted in injury or death, while the breakdown of mutual support networks during times of extreme stress could leave vulnerable individuals without the assistance they needed to survive difficult periods. Age-related vulnerabilities made certain segments of beggar populations particularly susceptible to winter mortality. Very young children and elderly adults had reduced ability to regulate body temperature and were more vulnerable to the effects of cold exposure, malnutrition, and disease, leading to disproportionately high death rates among these age groups during winter months. The disposal of bodies of beggars who died during winter presented practical and moral challenges for medieval communities that revealed social attitudes toward those who had lived on the margins of society. Religious doctrine required Christian burial for all baptized individuals, but the practical arrangements for identifying, preparing, and interring the bodies of people who had lived without fixed communities or family support were often inadequate or absent entirely. Many beggars who died during winter were probably buried in unmarked graves or mass burial sites that provided basic Christian interment without the individual recognition and ceremony that characterized the funerals of more prosperous community members. These anonymous burials reflected both the practical difficulties of managing the deaths of transient populations and the limited social value that was placed on the lives of those who had been unable to maintain their place within normal social structures. The religious implications of winter mortality among beggars created theological challenges for medieval Christian communities that struggled to reconcile the predictable death toll among the poor with beliefs about divine justice and Christian charity. If charity toward the poor was a Christian obligation, what did the regular winter mortality among beggars say about the spiritual condition of communities that allowed such deaths to occur regularly and predictably? Some religious interpreters argued that the deaths of beggars during winter represented divine judgment on individuals who had failed to maintain proper relationships with God and community, suggesting that those who died had brought their fate upon themselves through sin or moral failure. This interpretation provided a way to understand beggar mortality that did not challenge existing social arrangements or require changes in charitable practices. Others maintained that the winter deaths of beggars represented a failure of Christian charity that would be judged harshly by divine authority, arguing that communities had both the obligation and the capability to prevent such deaths through more generous and systematic charitable activities. This interpretation created pressure for improved charitable provisions while also generating guilt and anxiety among those who were aware of the mortality rates among local beggar populations. The statistical reality of winter mortality among beggars was probably never systematically recorded or analyzed in medieval sources, but contemporary observers were certainly aware that cold weather brought predictable reductions in the visible population of those seeking charity. The return of spring regularly revealed the winter's toll as familiar faces failed to reappear among the groups that gathered at churches and markets to seek assistance. The knowledge of winter mortality rates among beggars influenced the survival strategies that individuals and groups developed for coping with cold weather. The awareness that winter represented a genuine threat to life created urgency about securing adequate shelter, food, and clothing before the worst weather arrived, while also motivating the formation of mutual support networks that might improve the chances of group survival during the most difficult months. Some beggars attempted to escape winter mortality by migrating to areas with milder climates, but the practical difficulties of long-distance travel during winter months often made such strategies ineffective or even counterproductive. The energy expenditure required for travel during cold weather, combined with the challenges of finding support in unfamiliar communities, could actually increase rather than reduce the risk of winter death for those who attempted to flee harsh weather. The seasonal cycle of beggar mortality created a regular pattern of demographic change within beggar communities that affected social relationships, knowledge transmission, and group survival strategies. The loss of experienced community members during each winter meant that valuable survival knowledge was regularly lost, while the arrival of new individuals during warmer months created constant needs for education and integration of newcomers into existing survival networks. The reality of winter mortality among medieval beggars represented perhaps the starkest illustration of the ultimate consequences of social and economic exclusion in pre-industrial societies, where the margin between survival and death was narrow and the failure of social support systems could have immediate and fatal consequences for the most vulnerable members of society. The underground economy that developed around medieval begging created a complex network of relationships, services, and transactions that existed parallel to, and often in tension with, the legitimate economy, while providing essential support for the survival of those who had been excluded from normal economic participation. This shadow economy included both legal activities that were simply informal and unregulated, and illegal activities that developed in response to the inadequacy of legitimate means of survival for those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The most visible aspect of the underground beggar economy was the development of territorial arrangements and informal property rights that allowed beggars to establish claims on particular locations where charity might be solicited. While such arrangements had no legal standing and could not be enforced through official mechanisms, they served important economic functions by reducing destructive competition among beggars while creating incentives for individuals to invest time and effort in developing relationships with potential benefactors in particular areas. These territorial arrangements often involved complex negotiations and agreements among members of beggar communities, with disputes resolved through informal mediation, or, when necessary, through confrontations that could range from verbal arguments to physical violence. The ability to maintain a claim on valuable begging territory required both social skills for negotiating with other beggars and strategic thinking about how to position oneself advantageously without violating the informal rules that govern such arrangements. The rental and sharing of begging equipment represented another aspect of the underground economy that developed around charitable solicitation. Items like crutches, bandages for creating fake injuries, or clothing that conveyed appropriate messages about poverty and need could be borrowed or rented among beggars who needed to present particular appearances to potential benefactors, creating informal markets in the tools and costumes that were used for charity seeking. Some beggars developed specialized skills that allowed them to provide services to others within their communities, creating economic relationships that were based on the exchange of expertise rather than conventional goods or currency. Skills like medical knowledge for treating injuries and illnesses, legal knowledge for dealing with authorities, or social skills for negotiating with potential benefactors could be traded for food, shelter, protection, or other forms of assistance. The counterfeiting and trading of pilgrim badges, religious relics, and other items that provided legitimacy or enhanced charitable appeal created another dimension of the underground beggar economy. These items, which could be expensive to obtain legitimately, were often reproduced or traded informally among beggars who needed them to improve their success in soliciting charity from religious benefactors. Information brokerage represented a particularly important aspect of the underground economy, as knowledge about charitable opportunities, legal enforcement patterns, or safe travel routes had significant economic value for those whose survival depended on such intelligence. Experienced beggars who had developed extensive knowledge about conditions in particular regions could trade this information for immediate assistance or for favors that might be valuable in future circumstances. The development of informal credit and lending arrangements among beggars created mechanisms for managing the irregular income that characterized charitable solicitation. Those who had successful days of begging might provide loans to others who had been less fortunate, with repayment expected when circumstances reversed and the borrower had better luck in obtaining charity. Protection services represented another important component of the underground beggar economy, as those who were vulnerable to robbery, assault, or harassment could benefit from alliances with individuals or groups who were better able to provide physical security. These protection arrangements might involve direct payment when resources were available, but they were more often based on reciprocal obligations and mutual assistance agreements. The fencing and disposal of stolen goods created connections between beggar communities and more organized criminal networks, as beggars who occasionally resorted to theft needed ways to convert stolen items into the food, shelter, and other necessities that they required for survival. These connections to criminal networks could provide additional resources, but also exposed beggars to increased legal risks and potential involvement in more serious criminal activities. Some beggars developed skills in small-scale manufacturing or repair work that allowed them to create or fix items that had value within their communities, or that could be traded to settled populations for needed resources. The ability to mend clothing, repair shoes, or create simple tools from scavenged materials provided alternative sources of income that supplemented charitable receipts. The trading of children for various purposes represented one of the darker aspects of the underground beggar economy, as children who were particularly effective at soliciting charity or who had other valuable characteristics might be bought, sold, or rented among adults who could profit from their presence. These arrangements often exploited the vulnerability of orphaned or abandoned children while providing economic benefits to adults who controlled their activities. Seasonal labor opportunities created connections between the underground beggar economy and legitimate agricultural or commercial activities, as beggars who were able to work during harvest seasons or other periods of labor shortage could earn wages that supplemented their charitable receipts. But access to such opportunities often required social connections and advanced planning that not all beggars possessed. The provision of entertainment services, singing, storytelling, simple performances, or news from other regions allowed some beggars to offer value to their audiences rather than simply appealing for charity, creating economic relationships that were more reciprocal and less dependent on pure generosity. These entertainment activities could be particularly valuable during festivals, market days, or other occasions when people were gathered and disposed to spend money on diversion. Gambling and games of chance provided both entertainment and opportunities for economic advancement within beggar communities, though they also created risks of significant losses for people who could not afford to lose even small amounts. Dice games, card games, and other forms of gambling could redistribute resources within beggar communities while providing social interaction and excitement that relieved some of the stress and boredom of daily survival activities. The underground economy that developed around medieval begging was characterized by high levels of uncertainty, irregular resource flows, and complex social relationships that required constant negotiation and renegotiation as circumstances changed. Success in this economy required not only individual skills and knowledge, but also the ability to build and maintain social networks that could provide support during difficult periods while offering opportunities for mutual benefit during better times. The relationships between the underground beggar economy and legitimate economic activities were complex and varied, ranging from direct competition for resources to symbiotic arrangements that provided benefits to participants in both sectors. Understanding these economic relationships is essential for comprehending how medieval beggars survived and how their activities affected the broader social and economic systems of medieval Europe. The intersection of crime and survival among medieval beggars created moral and practical dilemmas that reflected the inadequacy of legitimate means of support for those who had been excluded from normal social and economic systems. While most beggars probably avoided serious criminal activity, the desperation that came from chronic hunger and homelessness inevitably led some individuals to cross the boundaries between legal charity seeking and illegal appropriation of needed resources. Petty theft represented the most common form of criminal activity among beggars, as the opportunity to take small amounts of food, clothing, or other necessities was constantly present in the markets, churches, and residential areas where beggars sought charity. The moral calculus involved in such theft was complicated by genuine need, limited alternatives, and the perception that wealthy individuals who possessed abundance had moral obligations to share with those who had nothing. The theft of food, in particular, raised complex ethical questions that even religious authorities struggled to address definitively. While theft was clearly prohibited by both religious and secular law, the Christian obligation to feed the hungry created theological tensions. When someone stole bread to prevent starvation, some medieval moral theologians argued that extreme necessity could justify taking what was needed for survival, while others maintained that theft was always wrong regardless of the circumstances that motivated it. The techniques used for theft by beggars were typically opportunistic rather than sophisticated, taking advantage of moments of inattention or distraction to acquire needed items quickly and with minimal risk of detection. The ability to disappear quickly into crowds or to move through urban areas without attracting notice made beggars relatively effective at small-scale theft, though their visibility as marginalized individuals also made them frequent targets of suspicion when crimes were discovered. The social dynamics of crime within beggar communities created additional moral complications, as individuals who were caught stealing might face punishment that affected not only themselves but also their associates and family members. The decision to engage in criminal activity therefore involved calculations about risk and reward that extended beyond individual consequences to include impacts on others who depended on group solidarity and mutual support for survival. Some beggars developed specialized skills in pickpocketing, shoplifting, or other forms of theft that required training and practice to perform effectively. The transmission of these skills within beggar communities created informal educational systems that taught criminal techniques alongside legitimate survival strategies, reflecting the pragmatic approach to morality that developed among people whose primary concern was immediate survival. The relationship between begging and confidence schemes created another area where the boundaries between legal and illegal activity became blurred. The presentation of false information about one's circumstances, the exaggeration of disabilities or need, or the use of counterfeit documentation to enhance charitable appeal all involved deception that might be considered fraudulent, though such practices were often seen as legitimate strategies for survival rather than serious crimes. More sophisticated criminal schemes sometimes developed around the organized use of children or vulnerable adults in begging operations that were designed to maximize charitable receipts while concentrating control and profits in the hands of organizers who might not themselves appear to be in need. These operations raised questions about exploitation and consent that were particularly troubling when they involved individuals who were not capable of making independent decisions about their participation. The use of violence in criminal activities represented a more serious escalation that was probably relatively rare among beggar populations, both because violence attracted increased attention from authorities and because most beggars lacked the physical capacity for effective violent crime due to malnutrition, illness, or other health problems that resulted from their living conditions. Highway robbery and other forms of violent theft were more likely to be practiced by organized criminal groups than by individual beggars, though some beggars might be recruited into such groups or might participate in criminal activities as subordinate members of larger operations. The romantic image of the noble highwayman that appears in later literature probably bore little resemblance to the reality of medieval criminal activity, which was more often desperate and brutal than heroic. The fencing of stolen goods required connections to networks of receivers who could dispose of stolen items while providing thieves with the food, shelter, or other necessities they needed for survival. These networks created links between petty criminals and more organized criminal operations, while also providing economic opportunities for individuals who had skills in evaluation, negotiation, or marketing that could be applied to illegal as well as legal transactions. The punishment of crimes committed by beggars was often harsher than the punishment of similar crimes committed by individuals who had higher social status, reflecting both the reduced social value placed on the lives and welfare of marginalized people and the belief that harsh punishment might deter others from similar criminal activity. Physical punishments like whipping, branding, or mutilation were commonly applied to beggars who were convicted of theft or other crimes, both as direct punishment for their offenses and as visible warnings to others who might be tempted to engage in similar activities. These punishments often created permanent disabilities that made it even more difficult for individuals to support themselves through legitimate means, creating cycles of criminality and punishment that were difficult to escape. Capital punishment was sometimes applied to beggars who were convicted of serious crimes or who were repeat offenders, though the application of the death penalty varied significantly between different jurisdictions and time periods. The threat of execution created powerful incentives against criminal activity, but it also meant that individuals who were caught committing crimes faced potentially fatal consequences for activities that might have been motivated by desperation rather than malicious intent. The legal processes used to prosecute crimes committed by beggars were often expedited and less thorough than those applied to defendants who had higher social status, reflecting both the reduced resources available for legal representation and the assumption that guilt was more likely among individuals whose lifestyles were already seen as morally problematic. The testimony of beggars in legal proceedings was often given less weight than the testimony of more respectable witnesses, making it difficult for accused beggars to defend themselves effectively against criminal charges, while also reducing their ability to serve as witnesses in cases involving crimes committed against them or other members of their communities. The imprisonment of beggars who were convicted of crimes created additional challenges for individuals who were already struggling to survive, as medieval prisons provided minimal food, shelter, or medical care while removing prisoners from any legitimate or illegitimate means of earning resources for survival. The experience of imprisonment could therefore create additional health problems and social isolation that made successful reintegration into society even more difficult after release. The relationship between crime and survival among medieval beggars illustrated the broader social tensions between individual need and social order that characterized medieval approaches to poverty and marginalization. While most people probably sympathized with the desperation that led to survival crimes, The need to maintain social stability and protect property rights created pressures for harsh punishment that often seemed disproportionate to the actual harm caused by petty theft motivated by genuine need. The complex moral landscape surrounding crime among beggars reflected deeper questions about social responsibility, individual agency, and the proper relationship between law and compassion that medieval society was never able to resolve satisfactorily, leaving each community to develop its own approaches to balancing competing moral and practical concerns. In the shadowed corners of medieval society, where the formal structures of family, guild, and feudal obligation held no sway, there existed a parallel world of relationships and loyalties that sustained life in circumstances that would otherwise have been impossible to endure. The bonds that formed among those who shared the experience of surviving on society's margins were often more intense and meaningful than the conventional social relationships that governed the lives of more settled populations, forged as they were in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual dependence. These relationships began, often, with a simple recognition that survival was more likely when shared than when attempted alone. Two strangers meeting on a road might discover that they were traveling in the same direction, that they faced similar challenges in finding food and shelter, and that their combined resources and knowledge could benefit both more than either could manage independently. Such partnerships might last only a few days or might develop into lasting associations that provided stability and support over months or years. The formation of these bonds required overcoming the natural suspicions that developed among people who had learned to be wary of strangers, whose survival often depended on guarding carefully whatever advantages they possessed, and who had often been betrayed or exploited by others in desperate circumstances. Trust had to be earned through demonstrated reliability, shared risks, and mutual aid during times of particular difficulty or danger. The rituals and customs that developed within these relationships served to formalize and strengthen bonds that might otherwise remain tentative and fragile. Sharing food when one person had been successful in begging or finding work, providing care during illness, or offering protection during vulnerable moments became acts that created obligations and expectations that could sustain relationships through the inevitable tensions and conflicts that arose among people living in stressful circumstances. The formation of family, like relationships among unrelated beggars, reflected both the human need for belonging and connection and the practical advantages that came from having reliable allies in an uncertain and often hostile world. Older beggars might adopt younger ones, providing guidance and protection in exchange for assistance with tasks that required energy or mobility that age had diminished. These surrogate family relationships often involved complex negotiations about authority, responsibility, and mutual obligation that reflected the absence of conventional social structures for defining roles and expectations. Without legal frameworks or traditional customs to guide such relationships, the participants had to create their own rules and boundaries while remaining flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances and individual needs. Women within these alternative family structures often took on caregiving roles that reflected both traditional gender expectations and the practical needs of communities that included sick, injured, or elderly members who required assistance with daily tasks. But women also found within these relationships opportunities for independence and authority that might not have been available within conventional social structures. The protection of children within beggar communities created particular challenges and obligations that tested the resources and commitment of adults who were themselves struggling to survive. Orphaned or abandoned children who were taken in by beggar communities required food, shelter, and care that stretched limited resources while also providing future benefits as they grew and developed skills that could contribute to group survival. The education of children within these communities involved teaching both the practical skills needed for survival on the margins of society and the social values and moral frameworks that would guide their behavior as adults. This informal educational process transmitted knowledge about charity, seeking techniques, survival strategies, and social navigation while also conveying beliefs about loyalty, mutual aid, and proper behavior toward community members and outsiders. The ceremonies and celebrations that marked important events within beggar communities served to strengthen social bonds, while providing relief from the constant stress and uncertainty of daily survival. Informal weddings between community members, celebrations of successful begging or temporary employment, or memorial observances for those who had died created shared experiences that reinforce group identity and mutual commitment. The resolution of conflicts within these communities required mechanisms for mediation and decision, making that could address disputes while preserving the relationships that were essential for everyone's survival. The absence of external authorities meant that communities had to develop internal processes for dealing with disagreements about resources, territory, behavior, or obligations. Leadership within these relationships was often fluid and situational, based on expertise, experience, or personal qualities rather than formal appointment or traditional authority. Someone with medical knowledge might take charge during health crises, while another person with extensive regional knowledge might lead during travel, and someone with particularly effective social skills might negotiate with outsiders on behalf of the group. The seasonal variations in these relationships reflected the changing opportunities and challenges that different times of year presented. Winter might bring communities closer together as they shared resources and shelter to survive harsh weather, while spring and summer might see relationships becoming more dispersed as individuals pursued different strategies for taking advantage of improved conditions. The geographical mobility that characterized much beggar life created both opportunities for forming new relationships and challenges in maintaining existing ones. The knowledge that companions might leave at any time for better opportunities elsewhere created tensions between the desire for close bonds and the need to remain emotionally protected against the pain of separation and loss. The loyalty and mutual support that developed within successful beggar relationships often exceeded what was found in many conventional social relationships, as the extreme circumstances that brought these communities together created dependencies and obligations that were both more intense and more immediately vital than those that characterized ordinary social bonds. The breakdown of these relationships, when it occurred, could be devastating for individuals who had become dependent on group support for survival, while also having few alternatives available if their primary social connections failed. The betrayal of trust, the departure of key community members, or conflicts that could not be resolved could leave individuals more isolated and vulnerable than they had been before forming such relationships. The inheritance patterns within these communities reflected both the practical reality that most beggars possessed few material goods and the emotional significance of the relationships and knowledge that constituted their most valuable possessions. The transmission of survival knowledge, social connections, and territorial claims often followed patterns that reflected personal relationships and community respect rather than conventional inheritance practices. The interaction between these alternative social structures and mainstream society created ongoing tensions and negotiations as beggar communities sought to maintain their internal relationships while also managing their connections to the settled populations from whom they sought charity and support. The loyalty and mutual aid that sustained beggar communities could sometimes conflict with the individual presentation and behavior that was most effective for soliciting charity from conventional society. The documentation of these relationships in historical sources is fragmentary and often filtered through the perspectives of outside observers who did not understand or appreciate the complexity and significance of the social bonds that developed among marginalized populations. The result is that the rich social world of medieval beggars remains largely hidden from historical view, accessible only through careful reading of indirect evidence and imaginative reconstruction of the human needs and capabilities that must have shaped such communities. Yet the evidence that does exist suggests that these relationships provided not only practical support for survival, but also emotional sustenance and social meaning that made life bearable even in circumstances that seemed designed to strip away human dignity and connection. In creating these alternative forms of family and community, medieval beggars demonstrated the fundamental human capacity to build meaningful relationships and mutual support even when conventional social institutions had failed to provide for their basic needs. As our journey through the cobblestone streets and shadowed doorways of medieval Europe draws toward its close, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of memory and forgetting, where the individual stories of countless beggars fade into the larger tapestry of historical experience, while their collective testimony continues to resonate across the centuries that separate their world from ours. The lives we have walked alongside in imagination were lived without expectation that they would be remembered, recorded, or regarded as historically significant by future generations. These were people whose names were rarely written down, whose individual stories were not preserved in chronicles or official documents, whose deaths were often unmarked by monuments or lasting memorials. They existed in the spaces between the grand narratives of medieval history, in the margins of manuscripts that recorded the deeds of kings and nobles, in the shadows cast by the great cathedrals and castles that dominate our visual images of the medieval world. Yet in their very anonymity and marginalization, these forgotten figures reveal truths about medieval society that are often obscured by the more dramatic and well-documented lives of the powerful and prominent. In the daily struggle to find bread and shelter, in the careful navigation of social hierarchies and legal restrictions, in the creation of alternative communities and survival strategies, medieval beggars demonstrated forms of resilience, adaptability, and human dignity that challenge simple assumptions about both medieval poverty and the capacity of human beings to create meaning and connection even in the most difficult circumstances. The seasonal rhythms that shaped their lives, the hope that came with spring's return, the abundance that might follow successful harvests, the dread that accompanied winter's approach, connected them to the fundamental cycles of agricultural life that governed medieval society, while also highlighting their exclusion from the security and predictability that land ownership and community membership provided to those who lived within conventional social structures. Their relationships with the settled populations from whom they sought charity revealed the complex moral landscape of medieval Christianity, where theological commitments to serving the poor coexisted uneasily with practical concerns about social order, economic sustainability, and the proper boundaries of charitable obligation. The daily encounters between beggar and benefactor were negotiations not only about immediate material needs, but also about fundamental questions of human worth, social responsibility, and the meaning of Christian community. The geographic mobility that characterized many beggar lives connected them to networks of information, trade, and cultural exchange that spanned medieval Europe, while also marking them as perpetual outsiders who belonged fully to no particular place or community. Their travels carried news, stories, and cultural practices across political and social boundaries, while their constant movement made them subjects of suspicion and regulation by authorities who valued stability and predictability above the freedoms that mobility might provide. The underground economies and alternative social structures that developed among beggar populations demonstrated human creativity and organizational capacity that operated outside and often in tension with official legal and economic systems. These parallel institutions provided essential services and support networks for people who had been excluded from mainstream society, while also creating their own forms of hierarchy, obligation, and social control. The intersection of crime and survival in beggar communities illustrated the moral complexities that arose when legal and ethical systems failed to provide adequate means of survival for all members of society. The choices faced by individuals who had to choose between starvation and theft, between following the law and feeding their children, revealed the limits of moral frameworks that assumed all people had access to legitimate means of survival. The bonds of loyalty and mutual aid that developed among those who shared the experience of marginalization created forms of family and community that were often more supportive and meaningful than the conventional relationships that governed the lives of more settled populations. These alternative social structures demonstrated the human capacity to create connection and meaning even when traditional institutions had failed to provide adequate support. The medical and health challenges faced by beggar populations highlighted both the inadequacy of medieval healthcare systems for serving the most vulnerable members of society and the remarkable knowledge and skills that developed within communities that had to provide their own medical care using whatever resources they could gather or improvise. The seasonal mortality that claimed many beggar lives each winter represented perhaps the starkest measure of medieval society's failure to provide adequate support for all its members, while also demonstrating the ultimate consequences of social and economic exclusion in societies that lacked effective safety nets for those who fell outside conventional support systems. The religious and cultural significance of beggars in medieval literature, art, and moral teaching revealed the complex symbolic roles that poverty and marginalization played in medieval consciousness, serving simultaneously as reminders of Christian obligation, warnings about the consequences of moral failure, and representations of spiritual authenticity that challenged the material values of increasingly commercial societies. As we emerge from this extended meditation on medieval poverty and marginalization, we carry with us not only historical knowledge about a vanished world, but also insights into enduring human experiences of exclusion, resilience, and the search for dignity and connection in difficult circumstances. The faces that once waited at medieval church doors and market squares have long since faded from view, but their experiences continue to illuminate questions about social responsibility, human worth, and the proper relationship between individual need and community resources that remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. The shadows that once stretched across medieval cobblestones have been replaced by different forms of marginalization and exclusion, but the fundamental human challenges of maintaining dignity in difficulty, creating meaning in uncertainty, and finding connection in isolation continue to shape individual lives and social relationships in our own time. In remembering the forgotten lives of medieval beggars, we honor not only their individual struggles and achievements, but also their testimony to the persistent human capacity to endure, adapt, and create value and meaning even in circumstances that seem designed to strip away hope and possibility. Their legacy lies not in monuments or written records, but in the continuing human commitment to recognizing the worth and dignity of every person, regardless of their social position or economic circumstances. As the last echoes of their voices fade into the silence of historical distance, we are left with the recognition that every society is ultimately judged not by how it treats its most powerful and successful members, but by how it responds to those who have fallen outside the protective boundaries of prosperity and social inclusion. The medieval beggars whose lives we have briefly shared remind us that behind every system of economic organization and social hierarchy are individual human beings whose experiences may not conform to the neat categories that historians and policymakers prefer to use, but whose lives and struggles reveal essential truths about both human vulnerability and human resilience. In the end, the story of medieval beggars is not simply about a vanished world of economic hardship and social exclusion, but about the enduring reality that every human community includes individuals whose circumstances challenge our assumptions about fairness, opportunity, and the proper ordering of social relationships. Their shadows still stretch across the pathways of memory, reminding us that the work of creating just and compassionate societies remains unfinished, and that the voices of those who live on the margins continue to call us toward fuller understanding of our shared humanity and common responsibility for one another's welfare. The cobblestones they once walked have been replaced by modern pavements, their threadbare cloaks by different forms of visible poverty, their extended hands by new manifestations of need and exclusion. But the fundamental questions their lives raised about human dignity, social obligation, and the meaning of community in the face of individual suffering continue to echo through our contemporary discussions of poverty, homelessness, and social justice, ensuring that their legacy persists not in the historical details of their specific circumstances, but in the enduring moral challenges their lives represented and the continuing human capacity they demonstrated for finding hope and creating meaning even in the most marginal and difficult circumstances.